Hello and welcome to our Saturday night chat show, or so it seems. So this is actually a really special occasion where we've brought together an incredible panel to talk about one of the most pressing issues at COP26, which is net zero. The UK government has made this front and centre of its agenda. But we have to ask ourselves why. I mean, the UK government, whilst here at COP26, has been very much promoting an agenda of big polluters. The most, I guess, destructive corporations here at the talks are also big fans of net zero. And so we're here to try and find out from our speakers, why is this case? Why are big polluters the biggest champions of net zero? And what does that mean for the climate? What does that mean for our communities, for the struggles on the ground, and I guess moves away from fossil fuel extractivism, from deforestation, from plundering of oceans, and from all the other sort of fights that we're seeing here. So we're going to go speaker by speaker. I guess I'll introduce you one by one if that's okay. We'll have about sort of 10 minutes each, 5 to 10 minutes each. If you could introduce yourself, well, if there's any other information you'd like to add beyond my sparse introduction, please feel free to do so. And then I guess we can take it from there. Maybe we can have a discussion amongst ourselves. Obviously, this is live, so there's no questions from the audience apart from you out there, but we're gonna keep it amongst ourselves. And I'm gonna kick off because net zero is a concept which is it's bandied around, but perhaps less understood. So we've got here Dorian Stabinsky, a scientist who's at the College of the Atlantic and has recently written 2 very powerful briefings for Friends of the Earth International on the topic of net zero and carbon offsetting. And I'd like you, just to try and give us that sort of overview as well as some more content of what are we actually talking about here, Dorian.
Yeah, so starting with net zero, because net zero has been in the news, and net zero, I mean, the pledges are coming fast and furious from corporates, from governments, and it all sounds really wonderful, net zero, so why isn't it wonderful? And we can start with a question like, why is it that an oil company like Shell can declare itself net zero as it's continuing to emit, as it's continuing to produce fossil fuels? How could it even claim to be anywhere close to zero, right? So net zero means, well, we need to unpack that term, the net and the zero, right? There's 2 terms there, and the zero is probably the most important one, but the focus here is really on net. The focus of polluters is on net. I think of net zero as it being an updated version of the very comforting myth of offsetting. And I'll talk about offsetting a little bit too, and why that's a myth. But the idea of net zero is captured in the Paris Agreement with this idea that it's a balance between emissions and removals, a balance between emissions by sources and removals by sinks, between what goes up and what goes down. And that sounds reasonable, right? It sounds reasonable, like, oh, that's great. There's going to be a balance and we'll get to zero and everything will be fine. And that idea of net zero then legitimizes all of these sort of crazy ideas like offsets. What's an offset? One entity emits greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, goes up. And you pay another entity to do something that's considered really useful to address climate change, right? So you emit, and then you pay someone to install wind facilities or solar arrays, and we call that avoided emissions. You pay someone to slow or halt deforestation, and that would be reduced or avoided emissions. You pay someone to plant trees or restore natural ecosystems, and that's increasing of the removals, right? So how we imagine an offset works is that there's emissions and there's removals. But as I said, not all offsets are removals. And in fact, most offsets aren't at all removals, right? Offsets are, you're paying somebody to build a solar array or something. So that leads us to the start of the fundamental critique of offsets, which is offsets don't stop the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. One entity carries on emitting. greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for hundreds to thousands of years. So if there's an entity that's emitting, you need something to bring down those emissions. You need removals. But the fundamental purpose of an offset actually isn't about the removals. It's to provide incentives for emissions to continue. It's to legitimize continued emissions. It would be great if everyone were at least using removals for their offsetting. And that sort of brings us into this, where I said that net zero was legitimizing offsetting, because this idea of net zero, that you emit and that you remove, and there's this nice balance, legitimizes offsetting. But emissions and removals, there's a couple, and I'll just list 3 of them, a couple of scientific problems with that idea of emissions and removals even balancing out. One is the different timescales of emissions and removals. I said that carbon dioxide has a residence time in the atmosphere of hundreds to thousands of years. So any netting has to be on the same time frame, right? If you are emitting something that's going to be up there for hundreds to thousands of years, when you pull it down, you better do it on the same time frame, right? But most of what we're talking about when we're talking about removals and net zero are temporary removals, right? We're talking about forests, and we know that trees die, but also trees go up in flames. And this is, we've seen in the news recently, the wildfires in California burnt a lot of removal offsets, for example. There's also different volume scales, and this is really sort of critical, which I think isn't emphasized. It's just not talked about. Our ecosystems have the ability, absolutely, have the ability to pull carbon down from the atmosphere. But most of the reason why they have the ability to pull carbon down and sequester more carbon from the atmosphere is because we degraded them or deforested them at some point. So we put carbon into the atmosphere and we're pulling it down, which is great, but there's not space in our natural ecosystems for that additional set of 60 million years of accumulated fossil carbon that we're burning and putting into the atmosphere. So scientists say that you can't, a shorthand for that is you can't fit the geosphere, everything that you're digging up out of the ground, into the biosphere. So in other words, this idea of net is fundamentally flawed, right? There are emissions and there are removals, but you can't add them together, right? Adding them together is like adding together coal deposits and mango trees, and you can't do that. And what we're seeing here, so just to kind of wrap up and lead into the rest of the conversation, is I think that the net zero and these net zero pledges are taking all of these problems of offsetting and magnifying them millions-fold, right? Because you have now this reason for the carbon market, and for the voluntary carbon market in particular, to create and sell offsets to balance out countries' and companies' emissions. And it's principally companies that are using this idea of net zero to greenwash their operations, right? They continue to put emissions into the atmosphere. They make a net zero pledge. They say, we're planting all of these wonderful trees and they look green, but in the end, think about where I started. Offsets, there are continued emissions into the atmosphere. Those companies are continuing to emit. And in fact, what we know of most fossil fuel companies is that they have no intention of stopping production. Net zero is a boon for them, right? It's this great gift. They're like, oh wow, we can continue to produce fossil fuels and we can green our image at the same time by claiming net zero, by planting all sorts of trees, right? It's about business as usual being greenwashed. So maybe I will stop there. Hopefully that's a good enough scientific introduction and I didn't get too technical. And
no, I think that was great, because I think This is a term that's bandied around, like you said, but yet there's very little understanding of what it means. And many people in the public, you hear net zero and you think, oh, that means they're going to get as close to zero as possible, rather than continuation with business as usual, like you explained, like the fossil fuel industry is doing. So we have next, as I speak on the great panel, Nnimmo Bassey, director of the Health of Mother Earth Foundation in Nigeria, who's been working, I guess, both on the international level as well as the local and national level for many, many years, seeing the impacts of what it means for many of these companies and their continued business models. But Nnimmo, give us your take on why these big corporations are so keen on net zero.
Yeah, I believe that the big corporations are so enamored with net zero because it's a lifeline for them. The whole world knows that it's time to shut down fossil fuel extraction, but they don't want that to happen because of profit and because they can literally kill for profit. They could do anything without being accountable, and many politicians are unable to hold these big fossil fuel corporations accountable. I think they're just building up on what we got from Paris. Paris set 2 temperature targets, 1.5 or well below 2. And I keep asking myself, maybe I should ask you, Doreen, if anything is well below 2, shouldn't that be less than 1.5? I mean, how can well below 2 be more than 1.5? So already the 2 targets were a big joke. And this is why what we're seeing today with all the NDCs is that the world is on track to go far beyond those targets. But coming back to net zero, as you said, it sounds really poetic and beautiful. Everybody likes carbon neutrality, net zero. Every politician is saying it because it's nice to say it, and it's the in thing. And if politicians accept that terminology and echo it up frequently, then of course the fossil fuel industries dig more into it because, okay, we can keep on extracting, we can keep on burning fossil fuels, there's no reason to stop it, therefore because we can capture it or bury it or do something with it. And then the investments can go on. And the investment that we've seen, the plans made for Africa, and for example, the oil, gas, and coal corporations plan to invest about $230 billion in the next 1 decade, about $1.4 trillion by 2050. Now, you talk about a lot of capital here, a lot of power, and a lot of money. And if they are to agree with us that for humans and other beings on the planet to survive, we can't look for more new fossil fuel deposits, then that would mean that they can't play around with this amount of money that perhaps the international financial institutions are ready to give them. But you see, the net zero plays out very badly for those who are in the front lines. It plays badly for humanity, plays badly for every other living being on this planet. This really, for over 60 years, my country, Nigeria, has been extracting and burning fossil fuels, extracting fossil fuel export. And now I hear politicians from my country saying, we need to keep on digging for more fossil fuels so as to provide electricity, to provide power, access for the people. So the question is, now, if you couldn't do it in 60 years, now, how can you convince me you're going to do it in the next 10 years, in the next 20 years? And how, if we look at the amount of harms, the pollution in the Amazon, for example, is enormous. It's clearly, it's not easy to describe the amount of pollution left by Texaco, which is Chevron, which is still a case, subject of litigation right now. You come to Nigeria, for the Niger Delta is one of the top 10 most polluted places on planet Earth. Go to Sudan, go to places in Southeast Asia, and check the refinery communities in the United States, people living in the first line refineries, having cancers and all things. This is clearly something that we have to run to just shut down as quickly as possible. And now, secondly, the sector does not provide what it promises. For example, the issue of jobs. In Africa, only less than 1% of the workforce on that continent works in this sector. So there's nothing to add to the economy in terms of well-being of workers, in terms of employment, in terms of addition to the general economy. That doesn't work at all. There's nothing there. And I think one of the biggest jokes I've heard for demanding that fossil fuels should continue to do this for foreseeable future is that Africa couldn't possibly develop with renewable energy because sunshine is not reliable. Isn't that funny? That sunshine is not reliable. And we're on a regular basis at least 12 hours of sunshine every day, all year round. And you say sunshine is not reliable, so solar power cannot be reliable. I think it's a big joke invented by the fossil fuel corporations to keep people down and to keep that dirty business. And this is there are many challenges around this idea that allows the fossil fuel sector to dig in deeper. Take, for example, the crude oil extraction going on in Uganda. This is waxy crude oil in a very pristine nature reserve around Lake Albert. Already, up to 100,000 community people have been displaced because of refinery and other infrastructure. And now there's a plan to construct 1,440 kilometer pipeline that will take this material from Uganda to Tanzania for where? For export. And so feeding the appetite of the world, not appetite, the appetite of the world of global north for fossil resources is so enormous. So they could sit down here, EU could say we're going to be carbon neutral by 2050, but they're investing in extracting fossil fuels in Africa, in South Asia, in Latin America. We just see the hypocrisy. Or some say we're not going to extract fossil fuels nationally, but you're extracting internationally. So what are we talking about? So net zero is really a trick and an abusive formula to keep on with a very destructive development or production methodology. I mentioned again another example of digging in. I hear a lot of people saying that gas is a transition fossil. We all know that it's not. But there's a plan to extend the West African gas pipeline from Nigeria to Morocco. Is it for supplying gas to West Africa? No, to bring the gas to Europe. And so we're seeing a system of that plans to persist, to propagate a system that is setting the world to the brink. And it's really alarming that at the end of the day, when this COP ends, the politicians are going to slap each other on the back. They're going to salute themselves. They're going to be happy that we've got a very good, we've agreed not to cut down forests. We've agreed to do this, and all the promises, net zero by 2030, by 2050, by 2060, by 2070. You just throw about any number you like. It's like a game. And look at what is happening at a time when it's been clearly said, even by the World Bank, by the International Energy Agency, that you can't extract and burn more than about 80% of known reserves, already known reserves. Now, a company from Canada has gone to Botswana and Namibia, to Okavango, and said, we've got the biggest new oil find in the whole world. They call it a play, fossil play, because they think it's a game, but it's not a game, it's about lives. People are going to lose their community, they're going to lose their water sources, they're going to lose their lives just so that some corporations can pile up cash and the power. And so that now, if a company is at this moment seeking to exploit for crude oil in a location that is a World Heritage location, that is so undisturbed, pristine locations, then we can see why net zero is being played up by fossil fuel corporations, because is what they could do to affect the imagination of the world, to make people feel like, well, these guys know what they're talking about, they're going to help us overcome the problem, but at the same time they're compounding problems and killing people, leading to loss of lives, and they're not accountable for it.
Thank you, Nnimmo. I mean, that's exactly it. I guess this is, so we hear the sort of more, the ridiculous accounting side that doesn't make sense, and now we hear quite clearly why the fossil fuel industry is so keen on it.
Yeah.
Keep up with the business as usual.
Yeah.
But this is, I guess, one of the problems in these talks. We think it's things can balance out, and it's about emissions, but it's not. It's about what are the business models, what are the practices of these fossil fuel companies, and what does that mean on the ground? And we spoke about loss of livelihoods, loss of jobs, and loss of life, loss of environments, pristine environments, to satiate, you know, neo-colonial appetites. This is the same model we've been seeing for a long time. So the fossil fuel industry is clearly a really big player in this and wants to continue the business as usual. And our next speaker, Maureen Santos from FACE, and so my Brazilian is rubbish, but also the Global Forest Coalition has been involved in recent reports looking at the forest offsets and how forestry is seen as this sort of the sink side that we're hearing about. So the fossil fuel industry wants to keep on drilling, keep on destroying local communities whilst offsetting. And, you know, we hear these big figures, let's plant 1 billion trees, etc. But they don't go into the details of what that means. Could you explain to us why, you know, why are these corporations so keen on net zero, and what's it mean from a sort of forest perspective and a forest dweller's perspective?
Okay, thank you. I'm happy to be here with all of you and for the audience that with us. I will talk about this impact of the forest offset, but also would like to talk about the report of Big Con. That's from our organizations that sign up. There is like 70 organizations that sign up this report, and part of this report talk also about this myth that we can compensate everything that Nnimmo and Doreen explained about net zero regard this kind of solution, of a fake solution, and using the forest as one of the elements that you can remove the emissions from the air and use as an offset to compensate emissions from the big industry pollutions. So this report is Bitcoin. I think it's, I don't know which camera should look, but anyways, this Bitcoin report, they talk about how these big polluters, are advancing net zero agenda, and they bring like 4 critical arguments that for us can be very strong arguments to deny this kind of policies. The first one, Nnimmo already talked about. It's about the time frame. When the governments, when the big polluters talk about 2050, it's so far away. No, it's so why they didn't do this at now? Why they really start to do real solutions right now? You can see what the outcomes of the high level, the presidency debate in the first 2 days of COP, and all the declarations that was presented, and all of them is related to forest, and none of these, only one's about methane emissions. You don't talk about the real issue, no? Of course the forest is a very important debate, and you need to debate deforestation to face the problem, but we don't talk about the fossil fuels, that's the main ones, 80% of the emissions. So I don't see not only the methanol one, but no more declarations about that. And if this country and if these big polluters just postpone the decision, just postpone the policies only to 2050, it's too long time to they really do implementation, and we depend on that to really change the system of this consumption and the production and consumption that we are living right now. So when you see this main target for the Paris Agreement about 2 degrees Celsius, or do efforts for 1.5 degrees Celsius, when you look for this time frame of 2050 is really ridiculous, because how we wait until there. No? So a lot of reports talk about this. The second point the report brings for us, it's about the plans. They bring us like very magical solutions that even exist in scale. No? So it's really, really bad. So looks like Techno-fixes and Nnimmo give examples for us about not least of which they are likely to sustain and increase emissions and consumption of emissions with intensive products like fossil gas, but also they put tremendous harm to the communities, the territories that's being risked not only to be displaced by the climate change outcome issues, but also for the solutions that net zero is bringing to impact the communities. And this, when you talk about forests and carbon offsets, for us in Brazil, it's a very, very big problem. Because right now, you are doing in all Brazilian legislation 2 processes. One process that's like you it's like the cube, magical cube. You take it out, instead of you organize the magical cube, you take the pieces out and you put together to be the same color. No, this doesn't work. And when you glue back all the piece color, you are put now based on auto-regulation and compensation and offsets. So these two ways, it's bringing a lot of bad policies on increasing deforestation, because we talk about, okay, we face the illegal deforestation, but when you transform in the legislation all deforestation in legal deforestation, you are, okay, now you can deforest because this is legal. So this is one of the things that's very, very critical, is one of the magical solutions they put to the other, to the debate. The other one that they bring like that is about solutions like fracking or methane emissions, and some kinds of nuclear also, this debate about nuclear, it's very complicated. When you see here in COP, a lot of young people also defend nuclear as a solution to face this kind of problems. So you have a lot of problems with the solutions. And I don't know about my time. Tell me, please, Pascoe.
Just a few minutes, yeah.
Okay. The third is about the concept of net zero, but Doreen already talked about that. And when you assume 1 ton of carbon emitted from the source has the same value as 1 ton of the carbon sequestered, it ignores profoundly the difference between the longevity and stability of the geological and terrestrial carbon stock from burning fossil fuels. So it's very easy for a big company like in UK, they keep doing whatever they want to do, and they buy some forest credits for a Brazilian Amazon forests. So they keep doing the same thing. In Amazon forest, you already starting projects that will have a big, big impact with the territories, with local communities there, creating a lot of troubles for these communities, because the projects that generally implemented, you don't hear the voices, you don't have the respect of the Convention 169 of the International Labor Organizations that have a concept that you need to consult in a freedom way the communities about any kind of projects in the territories, and to keep the emissions of a company in the north. To finish this point, we have also that this scheme of net zero, they also ignore the truth that the climate crisis is not a problem of technology, but a political problem. No, it's a power relation, it's a geopolitical issue, and we really have to talk about that. Because when you saw, like in the first days of this COP, the segment of high level, the leaders present all these declarations outside the regime, this was a really, really, really bad, and it is an absurd, because we are not supporting and strengthening the regime, the multilateral regime. We are doing things outside bilaterally or with a club of 12 or 40, even if it's 100, but it's not part of every country, every party of this regime. And with that, we don't have any kind of regulation, any kind of governance, any kind of safeguards, any kind of anything. So this is a very, very important point, and all these net zero schemes is pushing outside the regime for 2050. And we really don't want to do that, because it's fake, it's false, and also deny all the real solutions that we need to keep going and organizing together. And I hope, because this is also a problem of democracy and transparency, this debate. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Maureen. I think this is really, really powerful points, really important to mention also, if you've not read the Big Con report, Global Forest Coalition, Friends of the Earth International, and Corporate Accountability, the initial authors, and it was endorsed and supported by more than 70 organizations. Do check it out. And I think it's very fitting. We are here at the UNFCCC, and the net zero agenda, as you said, is weakening what's been built up since 1992, attempting to dismantle all the agreements that have been made to allow some of the big polluting countries and their corporations to get out of it. So this is part of a push towards, I guess, the privatization of the climate regime, if we're going to use that sort of language. But yeah, really, really interesting how we legalize deforestation. I mean, that sounds ridiculous, replacing it with plantations, and allowing forest credits to offset business as usual. So what the theme coming out is business as usual. You know, we are seeing business as usual from the fossil fuel industry to those using forests to offset. And so our next speaker is Tom Wakeford from the ETC Group, who do incredible research into technologies and sort of, I guess, the new frontiers that we're seeing from many of these big polluters. Rather than reducing their emissions at source, we're going to use techno-fixes. And we're seeing it now recently here at COP26 from the US government making a big announcement around agriculture, aim for climate. Tom, could you tell us a bit more about it, how this links into net zero, and why big polluters are so keen on it?
Yeah, thanks. Aim for climate may be the most dangerous aspect of net zero that you've probably never heard of, and that people might leave this COP without having heard of. But what it really is, in a nutshell, is net zero for food. That's what it's being sold as. And I think one of the reasons it might not get the attention it deserves, and actually agriculture in general doesn't get attention at these climate change negotiations, is that I think there's this assumption, well, we just need to stop the planet from burning. We just need to focus on that. But actually, the issue with agriculture is that there's no point having a planet that has somehow been stopped from runaway climate change if you can't eat. We need to eat as human beings. And so when the US government, when President Biden announced Aim for Climate on the second day of the COP, it was an announcement with huge ramifications, because it was really saying the whole food system needs a reset. And this was language that emerged during the COVID pandemic. The Rockefeller Foundation, Gates Foundation, lots of the World Economic Forum, the people that come together at Davos, started talking about the food system being broken. We need to rebuild the food system. And guess what? We're going to use the latest technologies. Now, I'll describe some of those technologies in a second. And this is a gamble, and one that we've, at ETC Group, been looking at for a while, because some of them are old ingredients, and some of the other speakers have touched on them. The idea that you can have crops that are climate smart, that somehow they are going to bury the carbon, and so by taking these crops, which you just plant, and you'll suck carbon out of the air, and you'll either store it in the ground, or you can do this carbon capture and storage. But you know, that's quite common. We've heard that before. We've also heard about genetic engineering, all the magic properties of taking plants and animals, engineering them, changing the amount of methane they produce, the amount of food they produce per amount of chemicals added to them. But perhaps the biggest aspect of this Aim for Climate, which is new, is digitalization. And this fits in perfectly with the Silicon Valley view for the future, which is basically we will use high tech, we will use satellites, we will use drones, we will use the very data from a farmer's smartphone, or a fisher's or pastoralist smartphones, will be fed into the cloud, and they tell the world, anybody that'll listen, that this will be great for the farmer, because they will get crops and livestock perfectly tuned to what's needed for that environment. But this sounds great, and of course, you know, many of us wouldn't want to be without our phones these days, but actually, who's owning all our data? And Facebook provides a really interesting analogy to what is happening, or what their vision of what could happen is. So there you are, traveling through a city, walking in your car, cycling, and let's say you've got your phone online. So that's, let's say you've had Facebook on, and it's telling at the moment, Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, whatever he's calling his company now, exactly where you are. It's telling you probably whose posts you've liked recently, what message you've put on, maybe some of the groups you're in, and then it gets data on all the other groups that they're in. So it's building a picture of you. So where you, of course, Google is tracking where you go on the web, and they call that social caching. So your social interactions, social media, that's all being tracked. What they're planning with the digitalization aspect of AIM for Climate is actually ecological caching. So all that knowledge that farmers have about their soils, about how to treat the drainage, manage their watersheds, their cattle, how they treat them, that in the vision of Silicon Valley is all going to go into clouds owned by Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and that would be really worrying, just the ownership of the data aspects, but this is all magical thinking. Again, as you've heard from other examples, there's no evidence this will actually benefit the climate, and yet it's built into this AIM for Climate vision where these technologies are just projected as being ones that there's just some faith, a leap of faith that all these technologies together will just do it. And the evidence base, when you look at it, is pretty much non-existent. In fact, John Kerry himself, in one of those moments like the Donald Rumsfeld moment about unknown unknowns, came up with this wonderful statement in a BBC interview, you can Google it, where he said half of the emission cuts will come from technologies we haven't invented yet. Well, I think that was in a maybe an absent-minded moment, really says it all about these technologies. But in the meantime, that's all like, well, maybe we'll invent these technologies, maybe we won't. Well, firstly, as you've heard, net zero is being used at the heart of these negotiations. So net zero for food is very much part of the story that's being told. But the other is, AIM for Climate vision is without farmers. Farmers will be de-skilled, they'll be taken off the land, they will be reduced to sitting at screens monitoring the drones and the other robots, taking images from satellites, or I guess they'll be allowed to mend the machines when they go wrong in some lightless facility somewhere. And there is no evidence that this sort of hyper-mechanization will work. In fact, the politics of this is the sort of comparison of the Green Revolution. It was said fed Asia, but actually was about the control of elites over Asia's food, and actually smallholder farmers were disempowered and often pauperized by that. And I guess the crucial thing is smallholder farmers who feed the majority of the population in the world. ETC, working with Grain and others, did the research many years ago, which still holds up the figure that 70% of the world's population is fed by smallholder farmers, and they cool the climate. So a plan like AIM for Climate that is essentially dispensing with these farmers would be disastrous. I guess the note of hope is that farmers have voices, and groups like La Via Campesina and food sovereignty campaigns around the world are fighting back against this. So they, at least, unlike the trees and the carbon capture facilities, do have voices.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tom. And hopefully this means that those who are listening will leave COP26 knowing what AIM is, being prepared to stop AIM and stop this technification of agriculture. But I guess the phrase that stuck out was John Kerry's quote, that there is no evidence base for this, that actually we're basing the whole of net zero on non-existent technology. So in the UK, we greenlit coal-fired power plants saying they're going to be ready for carbon capture and storage technology when it's created. And in the meantime, you've just got a coal plant. So this is what we're doing. We're sort of basing everything on distant futures, which are going to continue with business as usual. And I think the thing that really stuck out from what you said as well is, of course, yet again, we're putting big companies in the driving seat. So for this, it's going to be big tech and big agriculture. And we're actually dispensing of the incredible knowledge and abilities of those who are already doing the most to stop climate change and can actually transform a system. But I guess it doesn't fit with the plans of business as usual. So thanks, Tom. That was really interesting. Next up, we have Scott Tully from Glasgow Calls Out Polluters, who has been doing incredible work, not just as an activist group here in Glasgow around COP26, but also digging into what are the different sort of like UN schemes around net zero, who's been involved. So I think you've done a great piece of research on the Race to Zero, which is the UN's flagship sort of corporate-led, I would say, net zero fan club. Scott, could you tell us a bit about it and the companies in it and why are they so keen to be in it?
Yeah, indeed, that report should hopefully be coming out on Monday. So this is like an exclusive announcement, right? This is basically the press conference for that report. So yeah, great to be here, and hi to everyone tuning in. Yeah, I'll do my best to talk slowly, but if nothing else, I'll hopefully give you a good taste of the Glasgow accent. So yeah, our group, Glasgow Calls Out Polluters, have been campaigning on the UK government for a good 2 years now, and we've gotten quite familiar with what they want to achieve at COP26. And arguably, yeah, their biggest kind of contribution, or what they're seeing as like one of their flagship contributions, is this Race to Zero programme. So yeah, this is an initiative where businesses or institutions sign up to net zero by 2050 targets, very much as people here have already been discussing. But these go a step further. So these companies that apply to the Race to Zero go through a process of verification by an independent expert peer review group. So basically, in short, this is supposed to be credible. It is arguably a response to some of the criticisms already around net zero. And yeah, the Race to Zero campaign are very much at pains to tell you that what they're doing is driven by science. And I mean, I think we've all heard of, greenwash. It's a very common phrase. I use it all the time now, almost without thinking. But I'm going to make the case a little bit that, yeah, what the Race to Zero programme is science wash, using the language of science to gain credibility whilst doing things that aren't very scientific, shall we say. So obviously I'm somewhat limited on time, so what I'm going to do is just tell a story of a few key actors who I think bring into disrepute, one, the idea of net zero, but also importantly, the credibility of these UN and UK sponsored initiatives. So I'm going to start where I feel is most appropriate, and where I feel is most appropriate to start with is the sponsors, right? For all our guests here who are in the official UN blue zone, I'm sure you can't move for seeing their kind of images plastered all over the space. And yeah, that's partly because there's 11 sponsors at COP26, which, admittedly seems like a lot. But yeah, all are signed up, of course, to the Race to Zero, this credible, science-driven initiative. There was a recent report in a Scottish investigative outlet called The Ferret, a very useful report. And what they did was they just simply counted the kind of cumulative emissions of all 11 sponsors over the course of a year. And they found that, yeah, over the course of a year, these 11 sponsors emitted 350 million tonnes of greenhouse gases. So if they were a country, I think they would be the 28th or 29th biggest emitter in the world. So, they're a bigger emitter than Spain, or France or Italy, at least using the metrics of nationally determined contributions that's often used in the UN space, although that could also be problematic for other reasons, but we won't go into that for just now. So yeah, massive big polluting companies here we're talking. And all these companies, of course, are heavily involved in things like offsetting and carbon capture and storage. Of course, carbon capture and storage is looking so incredibly unlikely to work at scale, as we just heard recently, as John Kerry kind of accidentally admitted in a slight slip of the tongue. So I mean, like, how cavalier is that, right? With the climate crisis, like, how is that okay? But yet it seems okay to get what the kind of organisers of the Race to Zero programme have called a stamp of credibility. And of course, it's okay to get the sponsorship privileges at COP26. So I'm going to just touch on a few more examples. I mean, really, folks, I could go on forever, but I'm just going to touch on a few key examples to tell the story. The next one I'm going to talk about is Heathrow Airport. This is the world's 4th busiest international airport. And of course, I'm sure everyone here is asking, how can an airport be net zero by 2050? I have the answer. Just don't count the flights. That's it, right? Amazing. Genius. It's actually, I mean, if it wasn't so tragic, it would almost be funny. But I guess that's what you can do when you cook the books, right? And this is perhaps a good point just to highlight the fact that, again, the Race to Zero programme is apparently driven by science. Another company worth mentioning is Drax. So perhaps sometimes a somewhat unfamiliar name, not maybe so unfamiliar here in the UK because they are the UK's biggest carbon emitter. And also, they're very heavily involved in biofuels, and they are the world's largest tree burner, or the world's biggest tree burner. So again, you could be asking the question, well, how are these guys in the Race to Zero with all that carbon coming from trees? Quite a simple little trick, just don't count the carbon. And that seems okay. Drax, of course, are also heavily invested in bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. They actually call themselves a negative emissions company. The Drax CEO, I don't know if any of you, I'm presuming nobody in this panel was here, but I think at COP25 in Madrid, was it in the UK Pavilion? I think he made that announcement, right, didn't he, that Drax were going to become a negative emissions company. So, you know, don't count the trees you burn, and then, yeah, invest in bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. A beautiful, beautiful magic trick. The last kind of sector I'm just going to touch on is quite relevant and quite contemporary, if you don't mind me using that term. I'm going to talk about these kind of big finance announcements that have just happened in the last few days. These finance announcements are, of course, led by Mark Carney, the ex-UK Bank of England governor, and now the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action. And yeah, a big move by him, which has been given quite a lot of hype, was to get big financial institutions to commit towards this path to net zero. And by extension, this has also meant that a lot of these big financial institutions that are involved with the GFANZ, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, are also now, by extension, in the Race to Zero programme. So we are looking at big banks like JP Morgan Chase, you know, 800 or over £800 billion worth of fossil fuel finance provided since the Paris Agreement in 2015. Another example, Barclays, Europe's biggest fossil fuel financier, just over £100 billion since the Paris Agreement. I mean, it's really, really, really hard to describe just how awful this is in a way that's actually like broadcastable here. So maybe that's the best term I can use just to describe how illicit the activities of these companies have been. And yeah, of course, with all these kind of net zero commitments, or this kind of stamp of credibility that's given with the Race to Zero programme, these financial institutions are by and large expected to make voluntary commitments towards reaching net zero by 2050. Given their previous behaviour since the last seminal UN-based climate agreement, I'm not exactly holding my breath. So yeah, I'm going to stop there, because really I could go on and on and on. The same story basically repeats over and over again. So yeah, that's the Race to Zero programme for you, the flagship initiative driven by science. How about that? The only thing I think they are racing towards is sadly zero credibility.
Thank you, Scott, for that thoroughly depressing resume.
That's what I'm here for. Yeah, that's what I'm here for.
All
Anytime.
week. Thank you. We've got a whole other week of it. Do stay tuned for our next chat show. Brilliant. Yeah, as you said, if it wasn't so depressing, it would be hilarious. This should be a comedy show. But unfortunately, it is very real. So we've got science washing through the UN. Net zero is created by, sorry, not net zero, the Race to Zero is created by the UN. We have high-level champions like Nigel Topping, who is here to promote Race to Zero and get business in. And that credibility question is a real problem. I mean, I think this really touches on your point, Maureen, of this is the move away from multilateralism towards, as Tom said, putting companies in the driving seat, putting these big businesses in, and sort of how do we privatize these talks? How do we move away from it being governments to it just being corporations? And actually it should be governments regulating them and deciding what direction we go in rather than voluntary commitments. You know, the Race to Zero, as you said, is voluntary. So this is, yeah, ridiculous, but very real, and clearly here at the UNFCCC. So I think it's been really, I think we've got a really good overview of the sort of different faces and elements of net zero. My own organisation, Corporate Europe Observatory, have also been working on this along with others. And we did a follow-up to the Big Con report in time for COP that shows, yeah, not just that, of course, net zero is this big con, but that the use of net zero by these corporations, these same polluting corporations, has allowed them access to decision makers. It has allowed them a place in the room. You know, it's allowed them with science washing. We also call it blue washing, from using the UN colours. This lovely blue of the UN is wrapped around these dirty corporations to hide their practices. So we've seen a lot of blue washing going on. Huge numbers of meetings being secured with politicians, sponsors such as Microsoft, who is sponsoring these talks. Big supporter of net zero, Race to Zero. In fact, it's the biggest provider of technology to the oil and gas industry to help them increase and expand the oil and gas production. And yet here it is claiming to be sort of net zero. So this is highly problematic. And I guess underneath all of this is, that's what all I keep hearing is the sort of continuation, well, not, I was going to say continuation of business as usual. It's not business as usual. It's business as usual on steroids. You know, we're taking what these companies are doing and working out how they could do more of it. How could we increase the sort of tech fix elements of agriculture? How can we increase deforestation whilst labeling it as green? You know, increase the huge amount of fossil fuel extractivism we're seeing, rather than clearly what we need is transformational change. I mean, at the moment, the reason we're here, and we're still here at COP26, no closer to tackling this climate crisis, is because we're continuing with business as usual. So how do we get this change? And that's what I guess many of us here are fighting for, not in 2050, but today. And that's why I'm going to mention, I think, a statement that all of us signed on to. There was a global call for action from more than 700 organizations calling for basically no to net zero. And what we want is real solutions. So we want real zero, not net zero, real zero, and real solutions. And please do check it out. If you go to www.realsolutions-not netzero.org, and you can see the statement, see what we're calling for, and see what some of these real solutions are. So this was my next question, actually, my follow-up to all of you, because we're here denouncing net zero. We want real solutions. So what are these real solutions? I'll give you all, we've got about 20 minutes left. I do have maybe another question to pop in. But what real solutions would we like to be seeing? Who would like to go first? Yeah, go for it, Dorian.
Well, I'll start off and give a little bit more context, because I think about the offset market and the net zero market as a zero-sum space, right? It's I'm emitting, I'm going to pay somebody else to not emit, or I'm going to pay somebody else to plant some trees or something. When we think about what we need, it's transformation. You use that word, transformation. Transformation requires massive investments. We need to mobilize the money into the transformation of our energy system, the transformation of our agricultural system, the electrifying transport, right? And what you see, and it's Mark Carney with his task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets. What you see is they're really excited about net zero as a way to create this massive carbon market, where they're talking about the carbon market being worth $100 billion a year by 2030. Think about what that $100 billion could be used for, right? But instead of using it for transformation, transforming those systems, they're using it for basically greenwash, right? Yeah. So yeah, I think the solutions that are out there are, how do you take that $100 billion that companies are ready to spend and use it for the transformation that's needed in all of those systems? Completely,
rather than, this is, maybe to touch on the task force for scaling up voluntary carbon markets. Again, voluntary carbon markets. This is not governments regulating, this is voluntary carbon markets, 100 billion, mainly coming from the City of London. This is an agenda set by and for the City of London, when you've got the UK Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, as well as the COP26 President, Alok Sharma, both came from the City of London. And now they're giving back to their mates in the City of London. This is, back scratching all round. So how do we get that money into real investment? So that's, I think, a clear thing, moving away from voluntary, moving away from sort of private investments towards that real 100 billion. What could we spend on? Are there other, it's really important. Are there other sort of key things to bring out of net zero that people would like to share, or real solutions?
Solution,
yeah.
Yeah, because I think the COP is very short of solutions.
Yeah.
Oil Watch International has proposed a solution since Paris on what the world needs to do. Now, what we're seeing today is nationally determined contributions, as if global warming is a national warming, not global warming. People are just doing whatever they want to do at one corner, and then it's adding up very badly. Now, what Oil Watch has suggested is that since it's agreed that we should leave carbon, the fossils in the ground, we should incentivize this so that communities or nations who decide not to extract fossil fuels should be compensated. You know about carbon trading, carbon capture and storage. People are keeping carbon and then getting credits for it. So why can't Ogoni, for example, Ogoni is a territory in Nigeria who have left carbon, they stopped all extraction in the territory since 1993. This is real climate action. Keeping the oil in the ground, keeping it in the ground. They've done it against all the forces that range against the community, came against the community. So if you recognize such communities, compensate them, pay the climate debt, ecological debt, for recognized as climate champions, you're going to encourage other countries, other territories, other regions to do the same. And then we're going to get rid of this civilization that has hooked our brains so badly. A one-time Saudi minister said that the Stone Age did not end for lack of stones. And so we don't have to wait until fossils are gone before we stop depending on fossil fuels to drive a civilization. So incentivizing these territories and nations who are keeping fossils in the ground, to me, is one way of real climate action.
Brilliant. Yeah. So rather than carbon markets, actually compensating communities, so keeping it in the ground.
Keep
it in the ground. Yeah, has a nice ring to it. It's as if it's been called for a very long time from the climate movement, and only now we're hearing our institutional activists beginning to talk a little bit about this, but not in the way we would like to see it. Is anyone else? I mean, the other aspects or elements we would like to bring out?
To keep going after Nnimmo, because I think there is a very. You have this, but the oil and the soil, our strong one for a long time, and this is with this resource is very important to ally some public policies to keep the traditional people, indigenous people in the territories. So we need the demarcation of the land for indigenous people. You need the titularization of land for the Quilombolas people, not the traditional community, because these are real, the population that's really protecting the environment and keeping the climate the way we should. And if you take it out then from their territories, you are creating a set of problems that's not on climate, but a loss of biodiversity and hydrical stress, so much issue. Also, you need agroecology, because we don't think the agribusiness model should keep like that. It's not about you can reform the agribusiness, it's not this about. We really need a real system change. And for us, the agroecology is the main one of the options, because it's not only a system for production, it's about the movement. No, it's a movement that can push lots of changes for the society. So it's not about food sovereignty, but also you keep the families and the population who are planting good food, creating access for a better life, no agrotox, and there is 1,000 of ways to relation this kind of debate to the climate debate. So I really think this too is a real solution that we really can face and bring to the game, and it's not talking side.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Maureen. And agroecology is actually in the text at the moment, in brackets, from what I hear. Yeah, but I was going to tell, maybe you could.
I wanted, in brackets. I just wanted that for classic UN catchphrase.
Yeah.
I just wanted to build on that precise point, because it is clear agroecology works both in terms of cooling the planet and food security. But just to build on the point you made, who's doing agroecology in the world? It's largely smallholder farmers. But I guess more important is the question in this COP is, what is agroecology? Because having sat in the US pavilion today, hearing the speaker after speaker speaking on behalf of the US government and this initiative use the term agroecology, it was frightening. In fact, they used agroecology and indigenous knowledge as being things they draw on. So I guess the question then becomes, who defines these terms? Is it the big tech companies? Is it agribusiness? Who, my childhood began with sustainability being something that people thought was radical until it becomes a nothing word. Participation seems radical, then it's a nothing word. I think agroecology, there's a battle for it now. Aim for Climate's going one way, and on the other side, as you said, are popular movements, social movements that build the strength of smallholder farmers, peasant farmers, fisher folk, pastoralists to say what they define as agroecology. And I think that's what we've got to fight for, because as somebody trained in ecology myself, I certainly do not want the definitions left to, I'm afraid, researchers who have generally been bought off with, they may have the best intentions, but to pay their mortgages, pay the bills, they have to be beholden to these dark forces that want to define agroecology very differently. So I think it's also a battle around knowledge and an epistemological battle, if I can say that on a Saturday night.
We may have just lost a few viewers. Thanks, Tom. No, completely. This battle for words and battle for definitions is a key thing, and yeah, we're seeing now the language. I mean, you could say it's a success that we now see many of our terms taken up, but it also means there's this battle for, do we have the real meaning being taken forward? Climate justice being a typical example now, and hearing it from everybody. Yeah, complete capture. I was going to turn to you, Scott. As in terms of sort of real solutions, if we don't want net zero, how do we get there? What are we looking for? And anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, it probably just touches on what, or builds upon what everyone else has been speaking about. It probably just, I mean, it is system change, right? It is a different economy, but the elephant in the room, I guess, is, you know, ownership and who gets to control what resources, you know? Just now, most things, or a lot of things, are very, very unaccountable. And I guess what we probably need is quite simple and quite uncontroversial, right? More democracy, more sovereignty, you know, people owning resources, being in control of their work, you know, being in control of what they produce. These are like very, very kind of simple principles of like human dignity and agency. And it's almost sad that I'm sitting here in the UN halls having to say them out loud, but they are also principles that, if taken seriously, would have a real significant impact towards dealing with the climate crisis, because they are centred around real solutions like agroecology, like the good kind, not the kind of pretend kind that uses co-opted language.
Brilliant, thanks, Scott. Yeah, and I think what's going on inside these halls is a reflection of, I guess, the balance of power at the moment. Why is big tech and agribusiness all over the US pavilion? I mean, that's because of the link between the US government and these industries that we see at all levels. And I was just going to mention earlier this week, with Corporate Accountability and ourselves and other great speakers, we did a toxic tour of the pavilions, of some of these sort of pavilions, because I think it's worth highlighting the link between our governments and these industries. That one of the reasons that we're seeing the false solutions like net zero coming out of here is because of those links. And so we're seeing the UK, we're seeing the EU, the US, the biggest historical polluters, all pushing the agendas of their corporations. And so how do we go and tackle that? And actually something we've been campaigning for many years at the UN level is to kick these polluters out, to not have them here in these halls, to not have them here co-opting our language, to not have them here influencing the negotiations. But it's worth saying that kicking them out can only work if we also mirror that at national level. This is about toxifying big polluters, entire industries, and realizing that their interests are not the same as the public interest. And therefore, they should not be involved in regulations. They should not be involved in deciding what direction we go in. So I think, Scott, you touched on this being a democratic problem. I think we all completely agree. And so how do we make sure that we have, that we have the right sort of measures in place? There's a great example from the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry was kicked out of the UN talks on tobacco control because its interests were so opposed to those interests of public health, and we need something similar here at the UNFCCC. But that didn't just apply to international level, it applied to national level. And this is part of toxifying this industry and making sure that our governments, our supposedly elected officials, don't feel comfortable having those relationships, and therefore we can change direction. So I think there is definitely a lot to do. I realise we have a couple of minutes left. I'm going to give everyone, before a quick closing speech, last comments. If anyone last comments, what would you like people to take away from this? Shall I start left to right? Are we happy with this, or yeah?
I'd like to go last, actually.
I tell you what, we'll begin with the same order we had previously. Doreen.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I guess my ending message is recognize that net zero is two terms. It's net and zero. And that all of the obfuscation, all of the greenwashing is in that net. And we just need to take away that net, right? Because what we really need to stop global warming, we have to stop putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. We have to get to zero. We do that by leaving fossil fuels in the ground. We do that by restoring our ecosystems, et cetera. They can help us pull some of that excess carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. But that zero is the operative term there. And yeah, I'll end with that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Doreen. Nnimmo.
Maybe adding to the net issue, we shouldn't be caught in the net of lies and falsehood.
Yeah.
We need to be very careful about that. And one very interesting thing about the whole net issue is, apart from the fact that net zero is not zero, we see all the nations dancing to different figures, net zero by 2030, by 2050, some say by 2060, and one even said by 2070. Now, The mere fact that politicians would shift these deadlines to take action when they will be out of office is just a way of avoiding accountability, avoiding responsibility, and they have to understand that they have an intergenerational responsibility, that they have to be accountable for the children that they're pushing these problems onto, children yet unborn that they're pushing the problems onto. This is almost, I'm looking for a very polite term to use, but it's almost criminal. And it's something that shouldn't be permitted, should not be tolerated at all. And secondly, pushing this notion so far away makes it appear like we're not in an emergency, that, oh, the climate change is something, it's a small change, something you can play around with, like giving somebody a tip. So you put a tip in the Green Climate Fund, you put a tip on the table, you say you're going to do this or you're not going to do this. We really need to wake up. Our leaders need to wake up and take action and not keep kicking the can down the street.
Brilliant, thank you. Maureen, okay. Your closing words?
We just left the streets today. Today was the Global Day of Action. So have a huge, incredible, great march for a lot of people that screaming no net zero and screaming for climate justice, and really want to these voices come from inside, because we really want the real solutions. And we come back to our countries, pressuring our governments to not accept this kind of solutions, because we know that this is a part of the moment, no? But we really have to come back to our national government. In Brazil, you know that's a horrible situation right now. We're in a bad moment, but you keep pushing that, because this is a false solution, and you really have you need to recover for the future. Yeah? So this message for the streets is very important.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Tom?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking, as Maureen mentioned, this is probably the biggest day of global environmental protest in human history. And on a day like that, I think we should say to those who marched, I fear a lot may not have been thinking critically about net zero. In fact, I think a lot are saying it's an emergency, it's a crisis, it's a panic. Let's panic. And when you panic, you often make mistakes. And I think the danger is that people will think we need that awful phrase, all the tools in the toolbox. Well, this tool, in fact, many of the tools in that toolbox are corporate controlled and are not be in the interests of us. And if we draw on the knowledge of those who built the amazing agroecological smallholder systems we have around the world, and think critically, it's not like the things that can't be improved. There's amazing networks like L'Atelier Paysan in France, which improve technologies built on farmers exchanging knowledge outside the corporate net. Or the corporate walled gardens. We can improve agriculture without being controlled by Silicon Valley or any corporate mindset.
Brilliant. Scott, I'm going to give you 20 seconds.
Fantastic. I'll just give a very, very quick 3 words. Yep. Organise, organise, organise. Leave it there.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. So thank you all for joining us. We're going to wrap up. It's quite clear net zero is a huge con pushed by the most polluting governments and their corporations to get out of their commitments, what they've agreed to. We need to hold them to account. We need real solutions rather than techno-fixes, rather than carbon markets. We need real solutions that don't impact our communities, particularly those in the global south that are already feeling the worst impacts. So to get those real solutions, make your voice heard, sign up to the statement for real solutions, not net zero, and we will leave it there. Thank you very much all. It was a pleasure sharing a panel with you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.